Hi, my name is Kayla Arnett, and for my final folklore presentation, I decided to interview Professor Kerry James Evans and talk with him about his poetry. I also wanted to discuss how poetry is folklore and how personal narratives and poetry can tie together. So I hope you enjoy it.
But all my poems have myth in them and
Yeah.
story, and that's a real theme that runs throughout my work.
In the poem Buffalo Rock, Professor Evans details this landmark that his great-grandmother told him about that may or may not exist. In the poem, it's very clear that this story happens, but I think that hearing him tell it casually really helps with a comprehension of the poem. I think that a lot of times people are scared of poetry because they feel like it's inaccessible or hard to read, but once you know how to look for the story in it, it becomes a lot more manageable. It's also interesting to me the way that he tells it versus how he says it when he performs it as a poem. I think even when you hear someone say a story in casual conversation, it still has a cadence and a rhythm to it that is reminiscent of poetry. And to me, that's clear when Professor Evans speaks because he is very clearly a practiced storyteller and poet.
We had a story growing up. It's called Buffalo Rock. And my great grandmother said there was a rock out on their property that was shaped like a buffalo. And it was a Native American rock.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of Native American ancestry on my mother's side, my mother's mother's side.
Yeah.
And this is up in Fayette, Alabama. So this would be the Creek Nation. And so one day, I remember being a boy, we decided to go looking for this rock. And we looked and we looked and we looked and we looked. We looked everywhere. We couldn't find it. And my great grandmother, her name was Maud, she said, "It is there. It's out there. I'm telling you. We used to go to it all the time when I was a kid."
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "It's been in our family for years." So there's always been. I've got a poem about that too, and that's always been, the fact that we never found the rock seems to speak more to the idea of myth for me than had we found it.
Family stories and family legend can become folklore as it passes through different generations. For Professor Evans, the story of the Buffalo Rock, to me, immediately rings of folklore. Between the differing accounts of whether or not the story is true, that immediately reminds me of a legend, and the way that it was passed down to him from his great-grandmother, and even the story of him going to find this rock is very folkloristic. And so he tells us the story of the Buffalo Rock that his grandmother told him about.
It's called Buffalo Rock is Short. 10 miles south of Fayette, Alabama, a rock shaped like a buffalo stands somewhere in a thicket off a dirt road. My great-grandmother described how it was carved by lightning. She remembered the ground speaking. Before she died, I packed a lunch, and each weekend for a month, I went looking for it. Buffalo Rock, she called it. Though she must have been lying, because I never found the rock. But you and I know the only thing that matters is the rock. The rock and the field around it. We misconceive myth. A world inside a world inside a world. A place so quiet it fails to be heard, like a song poured from a jar. I know that rock's there.
Mm-hmm.
I know it because I believe my great grandmother. But I don't know if that rock is a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that it's there.
The Buffalo Rock story is also reminiscent of a hero's journey in the fact that Dr. Evans sets out to prove that this rock exists. He faces the tribulation of the tediousness and the time that he puts into this, but ultimately doesn't get anything from it. The story still has a departure, a tribulation, and a return, but in this case the return is a more philosophical one. where he decides that the rock still has a lot of meaning to him, even if he never found it.
It's because there's this idea, this myth, this buffalo, this rock that's there.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's there or not, the fact that I'm thinking about it being there, it's almost like the landmark that reminds me of my great-grandmother. It reminds me of going out there. It reminds me of all those family stories that we have on the land, and the mules and the meat shed and the meat house and all these other things.
Symbolism is prevalent both in poetry but also in spoken casual conversation, like when Dr. Evans said that the rock reminds him of his great-grandmother. This is just one of many narrative devices used even in casual conversation and folk retellings of stories that solidifies their place in folklore.
But so Justin and Kristen would come up. And this one time, I had some kind of practice. At the time, I think it was actually cross-country practice. I wrote a poem, I said it was football practice. I mixed it up a little. I mixed it up a little bit because you got to do this sometimes.
It's all right.
It's more interesting to come home from football practice than cross-country practice. But so there wasn't a lot of food in the house, and there never was. I was rail thin, and I came home once from practice, and there was one chicken pot pie in the freezer.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing in the world. And so I come home, there it is, and I'm like, all right, that's mine. I'm hungry, and it was frozen through, so there's no microwave to it. Like, you gotta, so it takes an hour. You can't mess with it. It takes an hour every time, 55 minutes, something like that. Put that thing in the oven, and I tell Justin and Crystal, I say, listen, that's my chicken pot pie. Y'all gonna have dinner later. I gotta have this. I'm starving. I ain't got nothing else in the house. Justin tells the story a lot differently. Justin says that we had talked about splitting it. I don't remember ever saying that because I was young, and I don't remember my young self being magnanimous. I remember my younger self being quite selfish. So I don't think I would have said that, but he claims to this day that's what I said. Anyway, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter in the end anyway, because he stole it. So that the oven went off. Justin goes in, he grabs it right before I can, and he runs off with it, and he eats it. And it's scalding hot, and so, like, it's not a pleasant experience for him. But he eats that chicken pot pie, and I find out about it, and I am just livid. And we get into the worst knockdown, drag-out fight you've ever seen in your life. We beat the crap out of each other all over the yard. I mean, it was a scene, So that's the chicken pot pie ballad. The chicken pot pie ballad. I walked through puberty, empty as county court on Sunday. Its Art Deco railings framing a yellowing marble floor, whose veins keep a vigilant watch on the footprints of all visitors. But no trial was needed this summer. My brother stole the chicken pot pie from the oven after I waited an hour for the infamous buzz of the timer, after I had just returned home from football practice, where I'd worked up the hunger of a soldier standing under Caesar's banner, crashing through those Oklahoma drills like a centurion who tosses his shield and runs bare-assed into a wall of enemy spears. And I wanted my brother to feel this kind of pain when I saw the empty oven, heat still spidering out on its invisible rope, a literal damn crumb trail leading from the house and through the yard, my brother stuffing every last spoonful of scalding gravy into his mouth. I wanted justice. That was the last morsel of food in the house, and it was mine. Mine like I claimed a country, If I had a flag, I'd have jammed it into the flaky, buttery crust and through the pie tin. But not even this could have stopped my vindictive sibling, hell-bent on seeing his own blood fall to the floor of the kitchen 8 miles out on a pig trail of a gravel road, so far from civilization, the only hope for rescue would have been if one of those Goliath eagles mystically left a Tolkien novel and swooped down with food and water. To my brother's credit, he did say that we'd split it, though I don't remember anything about that conversation. Besides, who splits a chicken pot pie? There's hardly enough there for one person, and even that leaves one hungry.
At one point in the interview, Professor Evans mentioned that each family has their own stories, and I feel like that ties really neatly into personal experience narratives and the way that personal narratives can be folklore, because a personal narrative or an anecdote is folklore in when it is told, it is performed. And generally throughout these tellings, the story changes a little bit each time as the storyteller focuses on different details or changes something small in the story, maybe adding a detail that they hadn't remembered the other time that they told it. Both of the stories that I've included today are stories that Professor Evans has with his family. The Chicken Pot Pie Ballad is a really good blend of folklore and poetic storytelling. While it has the same story as the one that Dr. Evans told me casually, it has its own charm to it. It has a specific cadence, specific word choice, it has metaphor, it has imagery, all of which are very specifically chosen to further the enjoyment of the poem and the message behind it. The story still has a lot of meaning when it isn't told in a poem and is still a performance, but the inherent difference between spoken word and poetry comes out.
I've got this poem called The Crow Child.
Mm-hmm.
And my mama said that I had a twin in the womb. And it fell out after I was born. She said she came home from the hospital and what looked like another child fell out. And I don't know if that's true or not. It seems a little specious, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom hasn't always been credible. So for me, like storytelling and myth is like what's true is a very complicated thing.
Folklore is defined in a couple of different ways, one of them being artistic communication in small groups, with another being the study of human creativity in its own context, which is exactly what we're doing here in studying the creativity and inspiration behind Dr. Evans's poems. The artistic communication aspect of it is pretty obvious in the fact that poetry requires language to perpetuate. Innovation and inspiration are inherent in poetry, because poetry is an inherently creative process that requires inspiration and innovation. Poems can grapple with the same topic using entirely different language between the two of them. They infuse differing tones, metaphors, symbolism, etc., all to tell a story. It's the art of crafting and organizing not just words as a whole, but syllables, metaphor, meaning, imagery, etc.
And that's the thing about poetry, right? It's like you're not just writing about things that there's more to it. Mm-hmm. It's like I gotta say this thing. It's that so what question, that why.
That's my film. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.